Hello, Daniel. A huge welcome to the show.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
Oh, I am delighted for you to be here. Yeah, I've been kind of like all day thinking, oh, I can't wait. Yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation. I would love to start with just knowing how you've arrived where you are, doing what you do, immersed in, well, we were just talking before the show about kind of being a bit of a Renaissance man. So it's actually many different fields, but very specifically your work and explorations in both spirituality and magic, which, as we were saying, aren't actually first and foremost, as far as I'm concerned, it's not actually like they're apart, but they can be seen as poles apart. And I'd say generally people tend to be kind of more deep in one than the other. Whereas for you, it just seems as though, nope, going deep in both is where you are. And I would love to know how you've ended up with that being your life.
Great. Well, I'll give you the summary. So in some ways, well, it's hard to tell which really came first. So I could get into blissful, peaceful experiences when I was a really young kid by just breathing and laying on my parents' down comforter downstairs when I was like around 3.5 to 4 years old. And then I lost that ability for unknown reasons. About a year later, I suddenly started lucid dreaming. And I remember my first lucid dream. And I remember it was my first flying dream as well. And that was when magic sort of started happening in my dream life first. And so there was this sense like in my dreams often have very magical qualities to them, shifting between realms, going through a door and ending up somewhere else, walking through a wall, making things appear and disappear. Magical combat at some point became a part of my dreams. And I'm not sure if that was media influence or just archetypal something or who knows what. And then I took a meditation class in 4th grade at the weird hippie Quaker school I went to that was all about like creative visualization, progressive relaxation, and exploring, imagining yourself very small and going around and fixing things in your body, which is sort of a kind of a mix of like, spirituality and magic and healing and things like that. And then around 14 or 15, I was practicing to have more flying and lucid dreams, so visualizing stuff before I went to sleep, and that apparently was enough meditative practice to get me to my first massive sort of energetic explosion of consciousness. And then I traveled out of my body for the first time shortly thereafter. The classic really quick, lift out, look back down, float through the wall, freak out, snap back, buzzing paralysis, and then what the heck? So it was very quick, but it was dramatic. Even a short time out can sort of change the way you look at the world. And then I had sort of 10 years of wandering where I was kind of raised. Can I just
pause you there for a moment? Because I already got about 15 million questions I want to ask just based on that, but I'll try not to ask too many. So
jump in. Never, yeah.
So I'm guessing from the sounds of the school you went to, your parents were fairly, at least open-minded, or were they actively into these kinds of things themselves?
Well, it's complicated. So my dad, if you asked him, he's a total engineer, muggle, materialist until you get him talking about ghosts, in which case suddenly he totally isn't. Right. So that's because he has real ghost stories and real experiences that he grew up in, has seen a ghost. So that's a little non-materialistic interesting, right? But he has a fascination with Gothic horror. And I was raised on tales of the supernatural and the Gothic through him. He had this massive book from like, 1920 or something. It was, a 1,000-page book of tales of Gothic mystery and horror. So there was and all of those have this sort of eerie element of the supernatural, the eldritch, the something like that. And so that's my dad, but he's also like engineer. And again, he presents muggle until you start talking to him. And then there's my mom.
And also, would you agree that his fascination and the fact that he had kind of had experiences seeing ghosts, like, suggests there is some kind of like openness and sensitivity to, non-ordinary realms, doesn't it? I think,
despite the way he wants to think of himself.
Yeah.
So and despite his conditioning, he was one of these guys like pocket protector with the pens, slide rule engineering guys in the 50s, and so he's got these multiple aspects, as we all do, right? And I have my own aspects. So I've got this, the side of me that also was very materialist, even during the time I was going through these kinds of experiences. So like there's weird compartmentalizations that existed within me. And then my mom, was relatively normal as people go, and like PhD, biophysics degree at Yale, so pretty into science and things, and then started having a bunch of powerful openings and transformations, and ended up wandering on the spiritual path and going to lots of retreats and rainbow gatherings, and wandering out there in realms of consciousness exploration and meditation and stuff, and having a whole wide range of experiences. And she is, most people would classify her as pretty far New Age-ish these days. And so I grew up with these sort of complicated mix of influences.
Yeah. I just want to ask you a quick question about this, because it's something I've pondered about in my own experience, which is, I didn't discover this actually till many years later. Like, I knew my father and knew, aspects of, what he got into, but it was actually only after he died, this is going back a few years ago, I literally just as I started training in shamanism, my stepfather suddenly told me something I'd never known, which was, whilst I was in the womb, my father was actually like a practicing ceremonial magician. And I'd never known that before. So it was kind of like, yeah. And I was like, I didn't know that. And that kind of explains a lot. And things happened to such a degree that my mum got really scared and asked my father to stop. So he, as far as I know, he didn't then, hence I wasn't aware of that, even though I knew he was kind of very open-minded and, was always interested in, non-ordinary states of consciousness, tarot, all those kinds of things. I didn't know it was kind of to that level until then. And it was kind of, this is really interesting, is the way that I have always been very kind of, before I was even really aware of what it was, I was very open kind of spiritually and magically. Is this a nature thing, as in because he was, I was? Is it a nurture thing in that it was kind of like seeded into my environment in ways that perhaps I wasn't aware? Both. So I've always had that curiosity. So you've obviously got it's an unusual but not dissimilar background to me in that way. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Wow, I have no great answers to the nature and nurture question, and I see strong arguments for both. Obviously, they're clear sort of magical lineages of like, oh, my mom could do this thing and I could do it, and her grandmother could do it. We can just do that. Like, how many times have I heard that? More than I can count.
Yes.
Right. And then I also know plenty of people who did not think of themselves as magical at all, who started through some process of practices or accidents or spontaneous, who knows what, suddenly found themselves having these sorts of experiences and adventures. And there's often no clear correlation with anything. Their whole family is like, what are you doing? You're weirdos, we're not, or something, and so I've seen it all go both multiple ways. So I have no great, obviously the answer is going to be super complicated. And I'm sorry, that's something of a cop-out, but I even if I talked more, I wouldn't be able to do much better.
Yeah, it's an interesting one though, isn't it? Because again, I've seen both situations over the years. But yeah, I love that. So what age was it that you said you had that kind of first big experience?
The first really big one was about age 14 or 15, and I'm not sure how old I was, but I know about the house I lived in, and I had to be one of those ages because we moved a reasonable amount. And so and because of that house. And so that was the first big one. And then I started having more. Like once that had happened, there was a whole lot more stuff that started happening. And it got way more complicated. I started having curious energetic experiences sometimes, and odd things, and sometimes some weird movements. And there's all kinds of things that happened. But when I started going on intensive meditation retreats, is when the sort of magical, strange aspects really started kicking into high gear. And this is where the first of the major conflicts came, other than the materialist thing, which was its own set of problems. But when I started going on Vipassana insight meditation retreats, started IMS and then went to India and started doing some retreats there, the insight meditation tradition is typically like, no, just see experiences come and go. Don't get caught in visions or weird things if they arise. If energy moves through, it's just something to just notice arise and vanish at an energetic sort of a level. Don't get lost in stories and tape loops. So the mind content is not really that important for this kind of practice. And so so I decided to kind of put away and or push away a lot of the more for sort of formally magical stuff other than the sort of weird kind of energetic magic that insight practices can create and the transformations and shifts of consciousness, that spirituality side. But I kind of pushed a lot of that away for a number of years. And then after I got some real footholds in meditative territory and I felt like things were kind of established, I kept running into endless descriptions of magic in the old books. So for example, these are a whole bunch of old Buddhist texts, and they endlessly talk about magic, you know, powers and traveling in other realms and healing and knowing
like
things.
The siddhis and things like
yes,
that.
The siddhis or idis, however you want to say them, Pali and Sanskrit. And they, you know, and there was this endless mention of them, and I kept finding it coming up again and again and again. And eventually I was like, okay, this is, there's just too much there. And then I ran into a guy I'll call Honey Bunny, and Honey Bunny was my sister's husband's sister's now ex-husband. So it was my brother-in-law, and he was a practicing Thelymite and, you know, in the AA, and very Crowley influenced, but had a wide background, you know, very broadly read and studied practitioner of magic and also spirituality, and also would consider those very integrated. And so we started having a whole lot of conversations.
Can I pause you there a moment?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, it's like everything you're saying, it's like I've got this huge appetite. I'm like, I'd love to go there, but I want to go back here first.
Go, wherever you want to go.
So when you kind of chose into kind of like, again, a more sort of traditional spiritual path, can you think back as to what was your reason for doing so? Was it just one of those kind of like, this feels aligned, there isn't really, I'm not going there for a particular goal? You know, some people enter a kind of spiritual path because they are very actively seeking kind of relief from suffering. They really, you know, really actively want that peace of mind. Others, for whatever reason, kind of are just taken down that path because it's, you know, what they're meant to be doing. Can you remember what for you was that kind of what drew you into that?
Yeah, there were a lot of different things. The first was that first major opening had clearly started some process that jacked up kind of philosophical interest. It jacked up the ability to be, or the capacity or tendency to be fascinated by things like quantum mechanics and the curious problems of consciousness. My, I guess it was 8th or 9th grade science teacher recommended I read the book, The Dancing Wooly Masters, which was one of these early, like, you know, sort of Zen Taoism and the new physics books. And I was fascinated by the paradoxes where, like, for example, a mechanistic view of the universe would seem to imply that I had no free will, and yet I very much seem to have the experience of one. The interdependence of, you know, particles and forces would seem to imply that I was not a separate entity, and yet I had the experience of one. That really bothered me. I was like, clearly the fact that I have a sense of will and the sense of being a separate entity is wrong. That I was thoroughly convinced of that, and yet my experience of being that seemed quite palpably that. And so that was one of the things that drove me. The other one was that having crossed something of a point of no return, I think at 14 or 15, that there was something driving me to find things, seek things, to think about things. And so I ran into a guy named Kenneth Folk, and Kenneth Folk had crossed a similar point of no return in very different circumstances. He was about 10 years older than me, and we ended up in a band together. He was the bass player, I was the sound guy, and then we lived in a band house together for a year almost. And we endlessly philosophized and started running into Ken Wilber and T.S. Eliot and spectrum of consciousness concepts, and we started, you know, Tolstoy and a lot of these people who seemed eventually to lead to mystical practices and revelations, and that seemed impossible. And then he went off to California, met this guy Bill Hamilton. Bill Hamilton convinced him to go on a 3-month intensive retreat at the Insight Meditation Society, and then to go on a year of intensive practice. He then left there after that was a very wild experience of 3 months of intensive meditation there in Barre, Massachusetts. And then he went off to Malaysia and then Burma, and did basically 2 6-month retreats back to back of super intensive insight meditation practice, had all these wild experiences. And when he came back, he was obviously transformed in some way. So if you've been on the road with someone in bands, you know them, right? You know kind of who they are. And it was like, okay, this is clearly an upgrade. This is clearly better. And a bit like about 2 years thereafter, I started going on my own meditation retreats, again, starting at IMS, and then going off to India and having some more adventures there, and then did some meditation at the same monastery in Malaysia that he went to. and following something of a similar path. But then I went to Bhavana Society in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, and this is Sri Lankan monastery where Bhante Gunaratana would occasionally mention powers and stuff. And I was like, okay, that's interesting, right? And I was like, wait a second. Then I ran into the old texts, and the texts were talking about powers, and they were talking about how you cultivate them. And I started noticing this crossover of like, wait a second, some of the candle technologies and like elemental technologies that I'm finding in ceremonial magic also are found in these old books, what they called kasina practices or elemental practices. And I was like, wait a second, I wonder if you could use these Buddhist techniques to get, make my pentagrams glow brighter or whatever, and so before I knew it, I was actively exploring this on retreat. And it turns out the answer is yes. So it turns out the old Buddhist practices suddenly made it so I could see the stuff I was drawing in the air during my LBRP or whatever. And then and before I knew it, I was like, oh, wait a second, there is a there. And if you just get your concentration strong enough and start intending and tuning in and calming down and getting this weird series of balances right, there's all this access to that it turns out the Buddha, for example, was really into and thought these were cool things to cultivate sometimes, but also said they're abhorrent and a distraction. So again, this is sort of weird dichotomy. Even in the tradition, you would find the Buddha praising these, adept practitioners who could do this stuff and going, they're amazing, they're example for the community, Mahamoggallana is excellent, blah, 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 and then you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't talk about it. And so both you find, and that's the relationship I see to magic nearly everywhere, right? So that's almost something of a microcosm of a kind of a universal reaction that you find to magic. And, this has been, and then I've found chaos magic, and I found, it turns out I'm not much of a follow somebody else's ritual kind of guy as much as I am a natural sort of chaos practitioner. Anyway, and then that led to
like
this sort of
chaos in a meta sense. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Chaos in a meta sense. And that led to this much expanded palette of, exploring all kinds of other stuff. So,
oh, I love this so much. So it sounds as though you had this realization way earlier than I did, where I think for various reasons, I really closed myself down as much as I could to things of this nature for a large part of my adult life. And a lot of that was just fear, like some of the experiences I had earlier were so scary, it kind of made sense to do that. But I think I also had this, just almost like, clearly it has to be nonsense. And the only people that would believe in things like this just clearly just aren't very intelligent. And then as I started to, one way or another, have my eyes open to the reality of magic, I'd realized oh my goodness, some of the most, brilliant minds that we've known of in human history have been deep into magic. What? How's this the case? And then, people that actually are still alive and, I get the opportunity to interview or get to know, and I'm like, hang on, there's something here. Clearly, people who are bright enough to know if this is nonsense, don't think it's nonsense. I had this really wrong. Whereas it feels as though you didn't necessarily have that kind of, maybe potentially because your mum was clearly brilliant and then, she was so open to this stuff, but it feels as though you never had quite that dichotomy in the way that I did.
I wish that were true, but that's not really entirely true. So there was this very strange period from when the first major openings happened at 14 or 15 to when I sort of found the validation and techniques and tricks and reproducibility and the potential of enhancing practices and frameworks that made sense of this and more of that. That was kind of a weird period for me, because again, there was this internal conflict between I am a physics major or a chemistry major, I'm doing electrical engineering or whatever it is, I'm rational in science and blah, blah, blah. And sort of I thought of myself as kind of raised secular academic, even though that's really not entirely true. And then there was this part of me that had already had a bunch of these experiences and again reacted. I reacted by sort of pushing them away, putting them in a folder that I didn't know what to do with, kind of compartmentalizing them away. And so I existed in this very strange hybrid space until I got more normalization and a community around me of other people who had done these things and had, were okay and clearly smart, intelligent, highly functional, amazing people.
For me, it was certainly when I was like, oh, okay, this is a whole other world that I just wasn't party to. And I don't know how, I suppose now you're so out there as in terms of it is a bit hard to hide what you're into. But I guess there was, as you say, a period where it's like, I can't let people know this about me. I think,
Sure.
you know, for many of us, there is still that sense of like, yeah, clearly not everyone's going to understand this stuff. What were you doing work-wise during the kind of period we're talking about?
So during the transition, you know, it really encompasses the years of like, you know, 14 to 15 to about age 26 or 27, somewhere in there. And what did I do? So I was, you know, in school, and then I went to college, and then I ran sound for rock bands and was on the road, had long hair, and was running around in like long black coats and, you know, that kind of stuff, and dancing in clubs and installing alarm systems. And then I did sheetrock and roofing and construction and lawn care and worked in a restaurant and all of that. And then I went off. Then I came back and went to electrical engineering school for a year and a half, and then I went off to India. But it was the summer of my year and a half of electrical engineering, going for a second bachelor's degree. I had already done some pre-med, but I didn't go to medical school at that time. And then it was during that summer that I went on my first retreat. And that was when it was like, right, all this wild stuff happened on that retreat. I was like, okay, there is a there. It's reproducible. Clearly, with straightforward techniques, you can make this happen. My strange rock and roll friend was not making this up. And so, you know, and then there was this sense of opening and potential and possibility. And also there were greater frameworks and depths of knowledge. And I found that utterly fascinating. And it was empirical. I could reproduce the stuff in my own experience. And that sort of also appealed to the scientist in me that liked to be able to see for yourself. Right. And I was starting to see for myself, and they had written down, if you do this, this will happen. And I did this, and this happened, and that was compelling. And it was like, okay, so there are some recipes, there's some pathways. Not that it isn't a very strange journey. I still very much consider magic like stepping into a jungle in an alien world at twilight that's never been explored sometimes, right? There's lots that's very hard to write down and put into tables and, you know, make a nice list of or have good correspondences for. But still, there is something of a scientific reproducible aspect to it as well. And so that right around that, so I went to India for a year, and then I came back, and then I did some nursing research and worked at the National AIDS hotline with the CDC. And then I got into public health school, and then I got into medical school. And so, but I was still going on retreats and stuff and still intensively practicing this. And this begins the highly compartmentalized phase of my life where I never talked about this stuff in school or work generally, you know, like, so, and then I was doing super intensive retreats. And I remember when I got to medical school, particularly second year, where they're talking about like definitions of crazy, where there were a number of us in the medical school, right? Make you a little nervous. There were a number of us in the medical school who had done intensive retreats or various other practices that can lead to some very way out there experiences from a mainstream point of view. And they were like, that's all crazy, needs meds and or doesn't exist and is pure delusion and hallucination. I was like, well, that wasn't my experience. And I'm this functional individual that can do these high level things. I don't think their maps and models are really that great. And so now actually my primary job is figuring out how to resolve some of these tensions. You know, that's what I do through the EPRC. Once I managed to retire from medicine almost 5 years ago.
Oh, I'm really glad. I feel like we could probably do about 50 episodes and I wouldn't cover all the questions I've got for you, but this
That'd be tremendous fun if you want to. Up to you.
I definitely think we need to come back and do at least one more. But this has led in a direction that I was hoping we would be able to come to, which actually I believe you do know of my shamanic teacher and his work. So my shamanic teacher at the moment is called Jez Hughes, and
oh yeah.
Yeah, and his most recent book,
big fan.
Wisdom. Oh, wonderful. His book's Wisdom of Mental Illness, and
I have it right there on my shelf. Actually, it's that a green one right there, a green and yellow right there. Is that book?
Yes, I recognize the colors. Wonderful. So, as you'll know, there's a real overlap between what you're just talking about and also this understanding of you know, what can be called shamanic sickness, and someone who is, I guess you could say, just like more sensitive, more open, and how they can go through these experiences that can be, you know, extreme experiences, you know, can look like things that we would call in this kind of more medical era, things like schizophrenia or I know that
the other common one.
Yeah, Jez, I think, had periods of like more kind of like epilepsy type experiences. And certainly for me, I have had a kind of huge range of sort of strange experiences. That wasn't until I started to understand it through this lens. It's like, oh, okay, this, and it really, was quite an emotional experience of like, it now makes sense, not just why I had it, but kind of gives meaning to it, it wasn't just a kind of, that's a shame, or, whatever. So I
Or
would
you
love
need a
to
bunch of
know.
tests and meds.
Yes, exactly. So I would love to hear as you've kind of like understood these things that you kind of started to understand during medical school, and then kind of over the years, the fact this has become actually an important part of your understanding and your work. I guess, what do you feel would be really helpful for us as a culture to be able to understand as we're looking at things that, again, we're saying, this is something wrong with someone, this is something needs treating, stopping. I'd love to like hear what you actually are seeing that would be useful for us to understand differently.
Yeah, so the first thing I'm actually going to do is refer to somebody else's work. There's a brilliant book that just came out by Dr. Brian Spittles, and it's this one right here on psychosis, psychiatry, and psychospiritual considerations on Eon Books. And it talks a lot about kind of how we got here, how we got in the sort of mess of the mainstream medical world, basically looking at everything through sort of a biochemical and a very restrictive lens. A very sort of, I almost think of as a punitive lens in some ways, but they don't mean to be, I don't think, generally. My colleagues in medicine and psychiatry, generally went into this to know things and help people, which is great. But the problem is, through this whole series of historical accidents, going back to Freud and his demonization of religion and spirituality, to the logical positivists, to the behavioralists, to the efficacy of pharmaceutical and biochemical models for treating some aspects of mental illness, we ended up in a place where we have we're an anomaly. Basically, there's no other culture in the world that has ever had this super restrictive, non-spiritual bent and take on it. It's historically like, many significant, it's very significant outlier. And so, the history of how we end up here is interesting. But what I think needs to happen is you've got to do a bunch of things. One is the clinical mainstream has to change, because I don't think there's any way this stuff is ever going to feel comfortable while a physician could take away your rights, label you, force medicate you, label you as broken forever. And that kind of stigma translates to the workplace. It translates to careers. It translates, more than half of the members of the EPRC are not public about it. This is this organization I run that's trying to do all the science to change the clinical, public health mainstream with regard to this stuff. And so, they're not even comfortable being on the website or listed, because it's just too taboo, even though these are fine, excellent, functional people that might have, PhDs and be doctors and lawyers and all kinds of stuff, right? And so there's a lot of science that I think that needs to happen. There's a lot of outcome studies that compare frameworks of like, hey, if you look at this through a mainstream clinical lens versus you look at it through a more spiritual, religious, energetic, magical, whatever kind of lens, transformational lens. And can you compare those outcomes so people can make good informed choices and have something other than just, this is the way it's going to be and this is the only possible lens for you, despite that disagrees with the actual paradigm of the vast majority of people in the world. Right. So this sort of materialist lens is a clear outlier. Most of the world's people are religious, have had some of these experiences. I think there's a study that just came out in one of the major polls, 25% of Americans have seen a ghost, for example. Like, a quarter of the population is psychotic. Are you sure? Maybe not. Right. It's getting a little much at that point, And so I think so we have a massive plan through the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium. If you want to see our grand design of a multi-decades long plan of how you do the science and normalization and outcome studies and comparative frameworks. And because ethics, I think, compels us to do what is right for people and to give them as much informed choice as we can. And currently there's not good comparative data on, non-medication based options, for example, or alternative frameworks for looking at this. And we want to have that data so people can make informed choices, clinicians, healthcare systems, and the people. And to put a lot more power whenever possible back in people's hands. that hopefully leads to, again, autonomy and doing good and avoiding needlessly pathologizing things that might ultimately have been very beneficial and transformational, and then figuring out linguistically and conceptually how you scale that globally. So these are medical ethical principles that kind of drive us in our own work at the EPRC. And that's what I spend most of my time working on these days, is that sort of global systemic change.
Oh, incredible.
With a remarkable team, by the way. So
yeah, it's a really incredible, much needed. So a couple of questions. I don't know which order to ask them in. So one of the things that occurred to me was, given Jung was kind of, very influential in this kind of whole, this understanding of psychology and, all of this thing. And he, as I'm sure was so open to all of this, so
kind
open.
of, but he wouldn't have the Red Book published, which is his major magical mystical tome, until long after his death. So even he was not he was still at least partially in the closet. And
there's also there's a difference between in the closet, like you've just said. You've got people who would be scared to put their names on your website, but are very open to it. So of course we're a product of our era, but he personally was definitely open to it, hence writing the Red Book, and definitely in his other book, not publishing it, but he was publishing other things. I don't think yeah, I mean, you don't have to read very much of him to be describing things that don't materially completely make sense. So,
but there's nothing of him in the DSM. Like, if you'll find a word from Jung, that would amaze me. I've read through the entire thing. I don't remember seeing a thing.
That was really my question.
There's nothing in ICD-10 or 11 diagnostic codes. There's nothing. There's nothing in the core enforcement. There's nothing in the CCMD3, which is the Chinese equivalent. There's nothing if there's anything in the Latin American equivalents of those, I've never heard of it. And so there is still this weird thing. While yes, people point out Jung, but you actually look at his impact on the clinical mainstream, and as far as I can tell, it's not there. If it is, I would love someone to show me. And but find me a diagnostic code, or find me a treatment protocol if you're having a massive archetypal, opening or something, right? Find me that in mainstream psychiatry. Transpersonal, yes. Mainstream, no. And so, yes, someone that he might get historically mentioned in the same way that Freud might these days. But these days, someone being trained in all this stuff, it's all going to be like CBT and IFS, which are cool. Like, they're neat things, right? And IFS sort of converge into kind of archetypal territory. It's almost like a gateway drug to Jung, right? But it's still a little sanitized, and particularly in its mainstream presentations. And certainly,
Yeah, so that was kind of what I was curious about, because I know, not anywhere near as much as you do about this, but I completely take your word for it that, it's nowhere in that kind of mainstream medical view. But how, given how influential he was at the start of all this, how has it got to the point where it's kind of been so taken out of it?
Well, again, the three big things. Well, there's a bunch of strains. First, the unreasonable effectiveness of the mechanistic view of the universe that brought a staggering number of super impressive technologies, right? Stemming out of Newton and then just continuing on, right? Even though Newton was a practicing alchemist,
yes,
right? What came out of him was clockwork universe, right? Which I don't think he would have been into in the same kind of way, right? Because he was much broader than that. But then you get the logical positivists, a philosophical school that basically, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, which actually kind of comes out of Galileo, which even though he was in some ways kind of opening things up, what came out of him is, if you can't measure it, it's not worth studying in science, basically. And so you get a lot of that. And then the technological revolutions, the industrial revolution, the sort of awe and people's amazement at these transformative technologies, steam and, internal combustion engine and radio and television and wow. And now the internet, right? So amazing. But then also you have the behavioralists, and the behavioralists, they were also weirdly compelling. So my father actually at Harvard saw and had lectures by B.F. Skinner, right, the great behavioralist, and he was 100% adamant that consciousness and experience were illusions, whatever that means. It's I don't know what that means, but anyway, and that they were pure automatons, and he could condition them to do anything through operant conditioning. They had no free will, and spirituality was purest illusion. And these people were very compelling as well. And then you get the biochemical revolution of like, your first real biochemical agents coming in, first, speed and MDMA in the early 1900s and through World War II, and then the benzos, first barbiturates, however you say it, and benzos, and then the typical antipsychotics and the atypical ones, and then the SSRIs. And there was the sense, no, this is all chemical imbalances in the brain. You're just crazy. We have meds to make you less crazy. They seem to make people less crazy, even though it makes them kind of stupid and gain weight and have weird movement disorders and all these other side effects, and they're expensive, and and so those all kind of converged in the weird thing we got in the DSM-3, which was really took out basically all of the Freud and all of the hints of something more psychodynamic, and really put in a tremendous amount of just biochemical. Because there was also this reaction against Freud, like Freud, really big 40s, 50s, coming into the 60s, a lot of people were like, no, we're not so into Freud anymore. He seems to be a misogynist. He seems to be this, he's a drug addict. His ideas about sexuality don't work for our time anymore. We're just kind of sort of throw out Freud, kind of, and so anyway, I'm simplifying, obviously, a much more complicated conversation. So yeah, thoughts?
No, that's really helpful to understand, because it always seems like we could have, in a parallel universe, we could have taken a turn where the understanding of these things was very, very different from that kind of basis of Jung and Freud. And then it's like suddenly, like you say, it's almost like let's throw all that out and go for a completely different route, whilst they're still so influential in, so many different forms of, psychotherapy and things of that nature. So it's always hard to imagine how you could do such a clean job of that, if you know what I mean.
It's, I try not to be paranoid of that, but it's such a complete erasure. It's such a clean cut that it's super impressive. And the only real sort of chinks in the armor of that are Lukoff, Lewin, Turner in 93 and 94 got in what I call the spiritual exemption criteria into the DSM at the new version that was coming out at the time. It's one of the variants, the DSM-4 or something. And they, what they managed to do is there's a few lines here and there that basically say, hey, yeah, this could be hallucinations or delusions, but if you're otherwise functional and it's considered normal within your culture and religious tradition, maybe it's okay. Except, which is great, it's 1% of what they wanted to get in, really, but it's the only thing that anybody's ever managed to change since, the thing to move it in a more broad, sort of re-enchanted kind of direction. And but yet the problem is what they then never got was the follow-up to that. Well, what are all the exemptions? What are considered acceptable in spiritual and cultural traditions? How can we justify that we didn't medicate this person? What's the legal cover for that? Are there actual practice guidelines of how you determine that? And they never got all the supporting documents you would really need to do something other than say, is crazy, needs meds. And so that the rest of that never really happened, and that's really unfortunate. And so the problem is the vast majority of clinicians don't really know how to use those, though there are a few that do. But it's not taught generally in schools. Like, for example, like alternative perspectives, I was talking to a psych resident, I think they were a second or third year resident, I can't remember, and they had never heard of transpersonal psychology or any of this stuff. And they just, all they knew about Jung was Jung archetypes, but he's kind of weird and was kind of crazy. And that's all they knew. And they're like a second year psych resident. And somehow, again, the sort of, bleaching of the entire thing was, weirdly effective. And to be able to draw lines that strong, it's hard. I still don't know the full story of how that was done. Or, for example, like a fascinating example, metapsychiatry and Stanley Dean. So Stanley Dean, the metapsychiatrist, I think that's his book right up there, and ultra consciousness was trying to build back into psychiatry, which was clearly starting to move in the opposite direction, all of the interesting effects that you might talk about in a transpersonal context. And basically somewhere around, and there were big conferences and there were people in power who were into this stuff. And somewhere around 1980, it just all vanishes. And he appears to, I don't know if he went to work for the military or the CIA or something. There's maybe that's what happened. And then like the whole movement's just gone. And nobody I've talked to, except a few rare old people with a lot of gray hair, have even heard of this 10-year movement that was trying to do this. They just wiped it off the map. And that's pretty impressive from a magical point of view. Like,
yeah. I'm far from a conspiracy theorist, but it kind of like gets you like,
it does make you think.
Yeah.
Again, I don't mean to, I'm trying not to go all conspiracy, but it definitely makes you wonder because it's impressive. The effect is impressive regardless of the cause.
For sure. So that exception that you touched on, it actually leads really nicely to the other question that I had, which is in countries and cultures, I'm just going to give an example here, but feel free to use a different example, such as say India, where, as you're saying, you know, they have a cultural context for this understanding of different kinds of experiences, different kinds of consciousness, just baked into their culture because they have that religious understanding of it.
Sort of.
Well, you were saying, you know, what you were saying, right, going back to before we got into the what we were just talking about, you were saying, you know, this is really the first time in history where we have a whole culture that just doesn't have this as a kind of, you know, understanding within a religious context. Therefore, we can only look at it through this kind of very materialist way of seeing it. And you sort of said, you know, as opposed to, you know, all these other places that do. And so what I'm curious is like places that are much more aware, like maybe not, you know, fully, but much more aware of things of this nature than say here we are in the UK. Is there a bit more of a kind of, you know, where you're saying this was just like an exception in the DSM, how would a culture where they do at least have a kind of much more religious, you know, religion being practiced, and it includes much more awareness of these things, do we see much more of that understanding in the kind of understanding of, you know, mental illness and things of that nature, or not? That's what I haven't asked it very elegantly, but hopefully the question made its way over there.
So the first thing I would say is actually, at least where I am, this stuff is, so the weird is mainstream. And that's the funny thing, mainstream, not clinical. The clinical mainstream diverges widely, but mainstream cultural. So within, you know, 10 miles of my house, I'll bet there are 15 or 20 Pentecostal churches where speaking in tongues and gifts of spirit and all that are totally normal. And, you know, I'm in a highly Christian and moderately religiously conservative area that would look at the DSM as being totally ridiculous. It doesn't allow miracles. It doesn't allow spiritual transformation. It doesn't allow conversion experiences. Whereas like William James in 1902 would have been way more comfortable with all those things, but he got totally written out of all of that. And then you've got the fascinating case that is India. So I'll give a weird example of sort of pushback if they have this in the context. I was talking with two Indian doctors, you know, physicians, who were practicing physicians, and they had started having a bunch of interesting, what I think of as energetic, or you could use a chakra or Kundalini sort of a framework. And I mentioned the words chakra and Kundalini and Shaktipat. They had no idea what any of those words meant. And then I started describing them. And then they said, you mean like that poster and the guy down at the, you know, on the wall down at the corner store? Like the, you know, the colored orbs.
Yeah.
And that's all they think of it is like some, you know, and because there's been this profound westernization and colonial influence that really isolated a lot of people who are coming up in more secular educational frameworks or more affluent households from the spiritual tradition that they live in the same way that happens here, right? The vast majority of people in the area where I live would have religious backgrounds, you know, at least believe in some miracles, transformations, maybe Jesus raised the dead, maybe people speak into, you know, that all that kind of stuff. And then there's the whole folk tradition here of like, you know, root doctors and, you know, people seeing spirits. We're in the South, at least where I am, being weird in that kind of way is considered like that's just part of the mix. You know, you start going down to like, you know, New Orleans or Savannah, and it gets even wilder and swampier, right? More interesting, you know. And so, okay, that's part of mainstream culture, and yet the clinical mainstream not. And you find the same things in places like India, where a tremendous number of ultra advanced spiritual frameworks and technologies and transformational texts and teachings and living examples and practice retreat centers come out. And yet I find the situation where two doctors growing up in India literally had never heard of chakras, Kundalini, or Shaktipat. And you're like, whoa, again, there's this sort of weird clean cut where they like, in order to kind of be in their social class, in their cultural class, like not knowing about or believing in any of that stuff is part of the sort of weird entrance criteria that came in through that imposed materialistic framework. Or if you read books like Esoteric Theravada by Kate Crosby, it talks about how, like, old school Buddhism, the Theravada, sort of, the oldest tradition we have access to, was very esoteric in the way it was a lot of practice with all these energy things and phrases and Pali, things that you would chant and visualize in all kinds of places and doing all this sort of medicine magic and birth magic and all this wild stuff, right? And that got largely suppressed or just crushed or kind of almost entirely disappeared when the Protestant sort of more materialist colonialists came in and they had to reform or just be destroyed, basically. And so these colonial influences, even on these traditions, can be quite pernicious from a magical spiritual point of view.
That really makes sense. It seems from what you're saying is in most places, regardless of the other differences in the culture, when we're talking about the kind of mainstream medical model, it's not dissimilar wherever you go.
Yeah, well, except Latin America and Africa, which and the Middle East is something of a black box. But it's very hard to find out stuff about mental health care there. It's been a challenge for me. But certainly Africa has a very, very loose and kind of hands-off relationship to the DSM. They're like, that's not really how we think about the world, but how they do think about it, you're not going to find a tremendous amount written down and protocolized. It's very much more like oral culture and just the time and place and setting. And South America and Central America also have this different relationship. So particularly in like Brazil, where like you could look at the work of Emma Bragman talking about spiritist stuff. And I have some, there are some EPRC members down in Brazil that talk about how the sort of notion of spiritism and animism and saints and energies and all of that is very much more, in the sort of meaning end of spirituality and magic is very much more woven into the mental health culture. And they might be way more comfortable with spiritual interventions alongside of and or in place of medical interventions. And so this is not, homogenous across the globe, but certainly in some of the places where Western colonialism and the materialist paradigm was stronger, you find it. And still, you're going to find plenty of, sort of educated, doctoral level people, even in these countries where they're more that way, that still think it's all just totally witchcraft and crazy and delusion. And it's like, no, not good, not real, not valid. We're not going to consider that or let that enter into our canon. So you're still going to find that, but I think not as much.
Yes. Wow. Really makes sense. I've got this whole another level of appreciation actually for, in my shamanic circle, there's a number of people that come from a more kind of like Jungian psychotherapy background, which again, for the reasons we've said, isn't, a particularly, there's not huge amounts of difference really when it comes down to it between sort of like Jungian theory and shamanism. There's a lot of overlap. But one of my friends is a psychiatrist, and it's only really through his conversation I'm realizing like, oh my goodness, that is actually quite, because of everything you're talking about, to be a practicing psychiatrist and a shaman, they're very at odds in terms of how most people would kind of like, in order to do this, you have to be in this model, and this is a completely different model. And I had no appreciation for that until this conversation. It really has opened my eyes to it's wow, which is literally what you're dealing with, I guess, all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the ER, I practice just very mainstream clinical medicine. This is what people came to me for. I'm a mainstream doctor. I know the mainstream protocols. I do the mainstream thing, right? Okay. That's what's expected there. That's the standards of care. There's legal and structural and, enforcement of doing that. And that's what people in theory were coming to me for. So that's what they got, right? And then in my own, private life and with my friends, some of whom were also doctors and, IT professionals and psychiatrists, all this interesting things. We were, practicing the deep end of exploring, what's possible and the endless varieties of that. So yeah, and that was my, and there's a very hard line between the two.
Wow. Yes. So we are sadly up on time. We definitely need to come back because again, there's like another 49 episodes for us to get through. Before we go, trying to kind of tie this up in sort of like a somewhat of a neat bow stroke cliffhanger. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing your sense of, so there's a kind of, I can see that what you're wanting to do is I guess create transformation at a sort of more systemic level. Looking at kind of, say for example, for someone listening to this that is hearing, oh, perhaps there is a different way of understanding kind of what's going on in the workings of the mind that again may have been diagnosed as, who knows what, some out of the many options in the DSM, and is hearing something in what you're saying. Is there anything that you could suggest in terms of the understanding of, everything we've been talking about earlier, spirituality, magic, that at an individual level you would invite people to look at?
You mean in terms of references or resources?
Could be references, could be resources. It could even just be, opening into ways of inquiring, practices, really anything you think would be a kind of like a step into a different worldview on these things.
Yeah, so I would definitely check out the work of the Groffs, right, which is some of these books over here. And that's going to be books like The Stormy Search for the Self or Spiritual Emergency, which has a bunch of different authors. I would check out A Path with Heart by Jack Kornfield, who's a PhD psychologist. I would check out the works of Emma Bragdon related to spiritual emergence and emergency. So these are some of the great grandmothers and grandfathers that we build the current structures we're working on now and continue to work with when possible. And so those, and actually Jez Hughes' book, The Wisdom of Mental Illness, is a fantastic one. It's a really great book. So those are some interesting places to start if you're looking to sort of expand out different ways of looking at this and getting into the conversation, seeing not only where it is, but thinking about where it might be able to go.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. And where can listeners find out more about you and your wonderful, I'm just as I literally finished this conversation, I'm like, oh my goodness, I wanted to get into like how you define magic. I know you've got this amazing article, which I'll link in the show notes. So like, I think it's like consciousness meets intent, but we will get into that in part 2. But where can they find out all about you and your amazing work?
Okay, so thank you. So integrateddaniel.info is my main website. You can find about the EPRC, which is the big project that we're trying to influence the clinical mainstream with good science and outcomes and all that. That's at theeprc.org. You can find the charity that I help run to support all of that at ebenefactors.org. You can find one of my books on like where a deep dive practice meets magic, meets insight, meets spirituality with a bunch of my friends at firekasina.org. That's Fire Casino with a K.org. You can find my free online book at mctb.org. And I've actually, if you're interested in more stuff about magic, I've done 2 very long form podcasts. If you're interested in some of that, one with Monk on a Motorbike, you'll find 3 podcasts there. And I think a similarly long series at Chaotic Thinking with Liminal Warmth. So you can find those podcasts if you want very long discussions about magic, but I'm happy to, redo, any and all of that material through the new thing that would emerge in the dialogue with you and your own experiences and perspectives.
Oh, thank you so much, Daniel. This really has been a pleasure. My past self that was looking forward to this was correct. Thank you so much.